I'm sure that by the time this video is released, the apocalypse will have befallen the Earth, Ash Ketchum will have turned 11 years old, and worst of all, Supergiant will have fully released their newest game, Hades, which would make the title of this video sound very dumb. Perhaps to avoid this, I could have changed it to be the original Supergiant trilogy, but that would sound more like there was a second trilogy that wasn't quite as brilliant, when in reality it's just one more game. And for what I've seen so far of Hades, it's highly enjoyable, and I'd probably pick it up if there weren't two other games currently higher on my priority list. If you also haven't already guessed from the title, I'm going to be talking about the three games released by Supergiant thus far: Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre. I've tried reviewing each game separately, but reviewing each of these games on their own feels akin to trying to review the alternative rock genre without once mentioning the Killers, Pearl Jam, or Nirvana. Each of Supergiant's games can be easily defined by three unique elements: the top-down open-world perspective that each of their games play from, an expressive and vibrant art style, and possibly some of the best soundtracks known to video games. In fact, the soundtracks are so good that when my friend first told me about Bastion around its release in 2011, I bought the full soundtrack on Amazon instead of buying the game itself. Part of that could have also been because I knew at the time that I didn't have a PC that could run games, but that's besides the point. The soundtrack for Bastion is now 7 years old and has aged like a fine wine, bringing back what I dare say would be borderline nostalgic feelings for OG players. And despite this, I bought the games in reverse order of their release dates. I got Pyre about a year and a half ago after it was heavily recommended to me by another friend of mine. I bought Transistor and then Bastion during the last Christmas sales, and I have to say that I regret not buying the latter two sooner, because each one of these games is a work of art. Now, I don't know what it is with me in indie games, but it seems like with each indie game I come across, I become even more and more less impressed by the AAA industry. Yeah, sure, Battlefield 2721 and Call of Duty version number who gives a shit may have fantastic graphics and great gunplay, but unless someone is a die-hard COD or Battlefield fan from the beginning, odds are that they'll dismiss the game as another heartless, soulless, brain-dead cash grab. It's like saying,
"Hey kid, do you remember that old shower head that you broke and sprayed water everywhere? Well, here, we brought it back, but this time we pasted some LED lights to the side so that your shower is accompanied by epileptic seizures."
I think that indie games over the past several years have become so impressive because their devs recognize that they need to actually be impressive in order to sell. These games have to strive to be unique, otherwise they'll be drowned out by the AAA game devs. They're damn well aware that they hardly even have to try to sell a game because slapping FIFA or Call of Duty on the front of it will be a reason enough for it to sell. Congrats to EA and whatever distributor is working with Call of Duty for making a successful franchise, but would it kill you to make a unique single-player game? Anyway, now that I spent the last minute or so gushing about how great indie games are and how shite AAA companies have been as of late, let's say I get around to actually talking about these games. Instead of reviewing each one individually, I'm going to be splitting this up into sections that talk about various common elements across the three games and point out the different approaches that each game takes to it. Yeah, I bet you didn't see this one coming. I've decided to put this one first because it's generally the first thing that you'll notice upon loading up a Supergiant game, and it becomes one of the main driving forces for the story. Unlike most other games that choose to either have narration lazily slapped on the introduction to give away all the exposition, Supergiant tells its story through narration that coincides with its setting, though it's never made explicitly clear right at the beginning. In fact, all of Supergiant's games, aside from Hades, which we already established that I'm not going to be covering in this video, start you off as a voiceless, clueless protagonist, and it relies on the setting to gradually reveal the story without ever telling too much early on. Because instead of wanting to complete the game just so I could say that I did it and for the sake of making a review, I kept wanting to play just so that I could learn a little bit more about the world that each game sets itself in. With the exception of some instances in Pyre, Supergiant also somehow manages to make narration not irritating, and have rather found the perfect way to implement it into their games in a way that makes sense.
But Fox, doesn't every narration piece make sense?
No, they don't. It's a commanding voice that you hear from the sky that the developers of the game often feel that they need to turn into a character so that you know what perspective you're playing from. Sometimes they skip out on the voice entirely and just go for walls of text, and if they do have a character, it's either told from the perspective of the main character, or some badass guy that will say is badass but really does jack all in the game itself. Even then, these narrations are often told as though they're memories, so once we learn who the person narrating is, we know that they'll live through the entirety of the game because they obviously have to live to tell this tale. In Bastion, the narrator is Rux, an elderly man who becomes the mentor for the main character. His narration is important because not only are we learning about the world through him over time like a normal human being retelling stories from their experiences, but also because he's seen all of what the kid is experiencing before. It's his narration that makes the player question their choices and helps them learn in the moment without giving too much away, at least immediately. To give you a counterexample of just awful narration, let's take a look at Marvel's Thor 2, which opens up with some mumbo-jumbo about how the Norse gods came to Earth to wage war against evil forces back before the Middle Ages hit Europe. This whole scene does nothing to progress the plot of the movie itself and ends up bringing up more questions that are further unrelated to the movie. Questions such as, if this happened so recently, why aren't there records of it ever happening? I think that this part was meant to symbolize, oh yeah, the Norse gods are familiar with Earth and left it long ago, or something like that, but it ultimately takes away from any discovery that the audience could figure out themselves if the movie instead chose to use the time they put into the narration towards reasonable dialogue that would help push the exposition. Coming back to Bastion and Transistor, we have narration throughout the game that helps carry the story along. Now, could you imagine how awful these games would be if they stopped every half hour of gameplay and dumped all their narrators' lines into one cutscene segment? Not only would that get annoying with the more or less vaguely expressive narration that Supergiant loves to have in these games, but I think it would ruin the game as a whole. For those of you who have played any of Supergiant's games so far, just imagine playing Transistor without the sword Transistor talking to you and leading you through the game until you came across a cutscene where he just talked for the entire duration and summed up what you were going to do next and what you had done so far. It sounds bad if I put it in that light, but that's what a lot of these narration scenes do and why they tend to wash over us. Narration, in my opinion, is best used when it helps lead a story in or guide one along. Admittedly, the way that I've been talking about narration so far could lead one to believe that the only good narration comes from movies or games that have narration guiding along. And it's part of the reason why it does so well in movies like Shawshank Redemption and The Princess Bride and other games like The Stanley Parable. It's much harder to do narration that leads into the story, and if you've been paying attention for the last 15 seconds, you may have noticed that I opted out of mentioning one of Supergiant's games altogether, Pyre. Pyre, in my opinion, is the weakest of the games in terms of narration, because instead of gradually easing its story through narration during the gameplay, Pyre instead plays like a visual novel with a minigame on the side. This means that there is a lot, and I mean a lot, of narration in between the gameplay, which is kind of cool, I guess, but there's so much of it that it separates itself from the parts where you actually play the game along with a massive roster of characters that they all end up washing over you without there being any meaningful impact. What makes it even worse is that the general narrator for the game sounds like Emperor Palpatine.
Reader, dare you tamper with forbidden knowledge? So soon after your sentence into exile.
Yes, perform the rites. Give in to your anger.
There's one thing about Pyre that surprised me on my first playthrough. See, when I had gotten a few hours into the game, I had already accepted my role as the voiceless, bland reader character, and had grown used to the different guttural sounds that are meant to represent each character's voice. Headwind sounds like your average adult man, Rookie has this sort of lilt to his voice that makes him sound like a proper nobleman or dog, I suppose, and Jundariel has this deep brooding female voice that has a secondary track under it to add to her menacing demeanor. Initially, I thought that this replacing the characters' voices with grunts, grumbles, and other sorts of gibberish was just to help the translation process, but oh boy was I wrong. Eventually we meet this one mysterious character, Sandalwood, who talks like the rest of the characters do until one point he confronts the player directly in plain English. Shivers went down my spine when I heard this tree man talk because I had grown so accustomed to other characters making sounds with the exception of Emperor Palpatine. It may very well still be lazy, but the payoff was very cleverly done by Supergiant. This has little to do with narration, I suppose, and in comparison to Transistor and Bastion, where you have a sentient sword and a weathered old man talking to you through the story versus Emperor Palpatine sometimes speaking from the sky, accompanied by tons of reading. Speaking of sentient swords, yes, that is pretty much exactly what happens in Transistor. In Transistor, you play as the character simply known as Red, who we discover has lost her voice, so in order to fill the void, this sword speaks in brief one-liners. No, I'm not talking about one-liners like how Marvel tries to make every movie comedic by having the characters all say the funny haha lines at the funny haha moments. Transistor, which also happens to be the name of the sword, will say things like, "Look, up on the left," or "Are you sure about this, Red?" consistently. To some people this can get annoying because this glowing sword will never shut up, but I find its delivery to be pretty spot on. Props to the ever-talented voice of Logan Cunningham, who voices pretty much all the narrative voices in all of Supergiant's games, including Emperor Palpatine. The narration never overstays its welcome and remains relevant to the setting, and it ultimately becomes the voice piece of the player. Towards the beginning of the game, we discover that Red was a popular musical artist known for her beautiful voice. The first time we truly discover this is when we come across a poster displaying her face, whereupon Transistor says,
I'm so sorry, Red. They took your voice. I couldn't stop them.
both affirming what I was thinking when I noticed the poster and teaching me a little more about the world that the game is set in without being overly intrusive. If there's action on the screen in Transistor, then there will remain to be action on the screen. The only time that the game takes a break for a cutscene is when the characters themselves take a break, whether that be when they take a transport to another part of the city, or when they rest, like the first time you find the sandbox tree and rest in the hammock. Other than that, it's a constant sequence of dashing to the next room, taking out the next series of enemies, and listening to Transistor reveal more about the world around us. Supergiant is to its unique art style and stellar soundtracks like Reddit is to killing memes in 3 days. Recently, one of my friends and I got into a discussion about Marvel movies, considering how they're now a part of the ever-expanding Disney empire. There's a whole discussion to be had there about how I personally feel that the superhero movie market is overflooded currently, but the point of our discussion was more about how, unless you are the most diehard soundtrack fan, picking out songs from different Marvel movies was damn near impossible because they all tend to blend together after a while. At first I thought that it was perhaps because a movie needs to constantly have other audio elements playing on screen, like sound effects or character dialogue, while games will sometimes have long bouts of silence while the player discovers the world. However, upon reflection, I realized that even with sound effects and character dialogue, we are still able to pick out unique classic themes for movies, such as the Star Wars theme or the brooding, horn-heavy Inception soundtrack. My friend and I are definitely biased in thinking this way, but we considered that video games often have soundtracks that are often as great, if not better, than movie soundtracks. The only main difference between game soundtracks and movie soundtracks is their mediums and how one can only reach so many people. Based on this, I think the fact that video game soundtracks get less recognition than movie soundtracks is just short of highway robbery. Perhaps I'm being hyperbolic, but my point is that time and time again I have found myself listening to game soundtracks over and over on repeat, while most movie soundtracks I've avoided unintentionally. It's very clear to me that the composer for Supergiant's game soundtracks, Darren Korb, takes what he does seriously and does a fantastic job making each game sound entirely different from each other. Transistor is set in a futuristic sci-fi world, and to complement it, the soundtrack mashes together the genres of minimalistic, experimental electronic, and post-rock. Most of the pieces feel somber and eerie, save for Coasting and Sandbox, which are specifically meant for parts of the game where the player is allowed to relax. If you think about it too hard, it sounds like electronic music in some genre of rock that you'd associate with falling asleep shouldn't mix, and yet here we are with what I believe is one of the best soundtracks to date. I just realized that I was writing down these soundtracks in order of how much I like their games, but don't let that note fool you. Each and every one of these soundtracks is amazing in their own right. Passion, the first game in the Supergiant trio, came out in 2011, and like I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, I bought the soundtrack years before I bought the actual game itself. I don't pride myself on my musical ability, but I can play guitar and piano to an extent, and I think what really got me going was actually this specific soundtrack. It is so down to earth and yet motivating all at the same time, though the soundtrack features only 4 main instruments: a guitar, a violin, a cello, and some percussion. I know what the insinuations are here, that all the tracks sound the same, and I suppose to someone who doesn't have a preference to soundtracks would have a tough time telling them apart, kind of like how I personally have a hard time telling rap songs apart. There's a bit of a blanket statement though, and I'm using the example because I think that out of all the soundtracks that Supergiant has to offer, Bastion is the one that tends to sound the most similar because of the way that it restricts itself to a very specific range of instruments. Pyre, on the other hand, has such a massively diverse soundtrack, and honestly it seems like the strongest part of the entire game, ranging from folk ballads to tunes that wouldn't be out of place in a rock concert. It may sound like the soundtrack was misdirected, but given the context of the game, there's never a point where the songs feel out of place. My overarching point that I'm trying to make in regards to these soundtracks is that they are all equally amazing in their own right. They are awe-inspiring tunes that go perfectly with their games, as background music for studying, or in my case, music to listen to as I write scripts for videos. Even if you're not interested in these games in the slightest, though I doubt it since you're this far into the video now, I would at least suggest that you give their soundtracks a listen. It's a tough topic to talk about, and if I sound redundant for the duration of this section, it's because I really have no idea how else to talk about soundtracks when the majority of the experience is just listening to it. As tough as that was for me though, this next part will be the roughest one for me by far: the art. Ever since the Terraria video, I've hesitated to harp on about how a game looks, because as soon as I show the audience screenshots or a gameplay of a game, I'm literally showing them everything that they need to know. Saying that multiple soundtracks sound nice may be redundant, but saying, oh, this game looks nice, borders on having the same attitude that adults have towards children when being shown something totally uninteresting. On the other hand, the art is such a major part of the Supergiant trio that I just can't ignore it. Like their soundtrack, Supergiant has one dedicated artist, Gen Z, to lead the design on their games. If I were to describe her art style in one word, it would be vibrant. Each character and setting are outlined and drawn out in sharp detail, and are further highlighted by bold color choices that attract my attention. In a way, I am saying that this game has wooed me with pretty lights and colors like a child when they first discovered their mother's iPad. I don't have much to say in comparison to what I had to say about the soundtrack, because the art is something that consistently follows the player throughout the game, instead of the ever-changing atmospheres provided by the soundtrack. Each and every one of Supergiant's games look great, and the colorful style holds its own against most other games that have tried to settle for realism or a specific color scheme. It may be bold of me to say, but the fact that Bastion still looks good over 7 years after its initial release just goes to prove that Pyre and Transistor will also remain ageless in their appearance. Want to know what other games were released in 2011 that have aged nearly as well graphically? Skyrim, Dark Souls, and Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword. Classic as the first two games are, we can't deny that their appearances pale in comparison to the nearly cinematic games released this year, such as Spider-Man, God of War, Red Dead Redemption 2, and Detroit Become Human. And even then, I don't think those games will look impressive 5 years from now, because new games with upgraded graphics will move in and take their place. I would be lying if I said that every Supergiant release is perfect, because it's just simply not the truth. The two main problems that the games always tend to run into are repetitive gameplay and how each and every one of these games ends in a very similar way. The build-up and characters are usually diverse enough to make a difference, but if you've played the story of one Supergiant game all the way through, then you've pretty much played all of them story-wise. Without spoiling too much, there's one silent character, there's the narrator character, and then there's everyone else in between. What happens in between differs between game to game, but in the end the player has to choose how they want to end the story. Though I suppose Transistor is sort of exempt from this rule because you don't really have a choice. At any rate, when I discovered that both Pyre and Bastion basically have the same ending, I was disheartened and almost didn't want to continue, yet here we are gathering footage for the video's sake. Gotta get that footage because it's the YouTuber way. The actual gameplay bits in each game become stale after a while, with Pyre being the worst offender. My goodness, Pyre is a visual novel for like 85% of the game, and if it's not a visual novel, then you're playing their weird variation of handball. The game has some interesting gimmicks to it, but each one is so linear in its style that I can use the exact same characters every time and still succeed regardless of what I do. Wait, that's like the Pokemon games. Transistor and Bastion felt less like this because Bastion changes based on your weapon preferences, while Transistor allows you to attack every situation however you like, within limits of course. What makes Bastion and Transistor better than Pyre is that the combat isn't directly related to the story, but rather as a challenge that the player must face in order to continue the story. This isn't to say that Transistor and Bastion don't have repetitive gameplay, but both games have moderately competent stories that compel me as a player to continue playing them, even though I knew that the ending was going to be disappointing by comparison. I have a whole bunch of notes here to tag on the end, but I don't think I can waffle on for long enough to make them anything noteworthy. I believe we call these notes nitpicks. Anyway, here we are. Pyre is a visual novel RPG, but it introduces and drops so many new characters within its short time frame that they all lose relevance. You may talk to the first three that you meet the most, Hedwyn, Rookie, and Jodariel, but they're eventually drowned out by the overwhelming amount of characters. Oh, there's a bird lady and she doesn't like Jodariel. Then there's Worm Man, and he's a knight looking to restore his honor. And there's Fuzzball, but he's a smart fuzzball. Transistor's story is so interesting that the combat becomes a chore in between uncovering more of the story, and honestly I think that if the combat didn't exist, this game would be done within a couple of hours tops. I don't think that the more drawn out a game is the better its quality, and honestly it can be frustrating to see game reviewers citing, oh there's 30 hours of gameplay, as if an impressively long story campaign means something, and Transistor is the same way. Sure, the time pausing mechanic combined with the ability to upgrade and rotate abilities through your hotbar is definitely interesting, but each time I ran into enemies I found that my mind sort of shut off simply because it wasn't interesting having to hack my way through similar combat patterns. This last one, I'm not sure how much of a criticism it is versus a personal gripe with how the story plays out, but Bastion's level-based approach made me quickly realize that my decisions were definite, and if I wanted to try again I'd have to go all the way back through the exact same section. To answer that question that's been sitting in the title for the entirety of the video, I think what makes Supergiant's trio so good is their ability to stick out in comparison to other games in the modern day game market. Their powerful soundtrack and unique art direction make them video game masterpieces that hold their own despite the drawbacks that may come with them. Honestly, if you haven't tried any of these games, I do highly suggest that you pick them up, and if you can only afford to get one of them, I'd pick up Transistor because, well, I think I've said enough about it, and in my opinion it is the best game that Supergiant has released to date. And that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Social links are in the description below, and I'll see you on the flip side. Goodbye.